November 14th, 1873. The smoke rose from the chimney in a thin gray line against a sky the color of old pewter. Clara Mercer stood at the edge of the property line watching that smoke curl upward into the cold Montana air, and she thought about how strange it was that smoke could look so peaceful, rising from a home that had just thrown her out like garbage. She held everything she owned in a flour sack: 2 dresses, a wooden comb her mother had carved before the crossing from Scotland, a small knife with a bone handle, 3 days of hardtack wrapped in cloth. That was the sum total of 40 years of living. The temperature had already dropped to 23 degrees Fahrenheit, and the sun was still up. By nightfall, it would fall another 15 degrees. By midnight, 20 more. Clara knew these numbers the way she knew her own heartbeat. 18 months on the Montana frontier had taught her to read the sky like scripture, to feel the coming cold in her joints before the mercury confirmed it. Her sister Margaret stood in the doorway of the cabin. She would not look at Clara. She kept her eyes fixed on something in the middle distance, some imaginary point where she did not have to see what her husband had done, what she had allowed to happen. The accusation had been simple enough. 3 silver dollars missing from the household tin. Henry Mercer had counted them himself that morning. Counted them again in front of Clara, made sure everyone saw the empty spaces where the coins should have been. His word against hers. But Henry's word carried weight in this territory. Henry had been here since '68. Henry had survived 2 winters that killed lesser men. Henry knew the territorial judge personally drank whiskey, with the land assessor had shaken hands with the governor during the railroad survey of '71. Clara was just a widow, a Scottish immigrant with an accent that still marked her as foreign after 20 years in America. A woman without a husband, without children, without anyone to speak for her. The theft accusation was a lie. Clara had never touched that money. She knew it, and somewhere behind those averted eyes, Margaret knew it too. But knowing the truth and speaking the truth were different things on the frontier. Margaret had made her choice. She had chosen survival over blood, chosen the man who owned the land over the sister who had helped her survive childbirth, who had nursed her through fever, who had held her hand during the long nights when the wolves howled too close to the cabin walls. Clara understood the arithmetic of that choice. She hated it, but she understood it. What Margaret could not admit, what Henry would never say aloud, was the real reason Clara was standing here with a flour sack and nowhere to go. The land. Robert Mercer had died 18 months ago. Clara's husband, Henry's younger brother. He had frozen to death checking trap lines during a February cold snap, found 3 days later, curled against a cottonwood trunk, like he was just taking a nap. The cold had preserved him so perfectly that Clara could almost convince herself he was still breathing when they brought him home. Robert's claim adjoined Henry's. 160 acres of decent grazing land with creek access and timber rights. According to territorial law, that land should have passed to Clara as the surviving spouse. But Henry wanted the land consolidated. Henry wanted Clara gone. And Henry had found a way to make that happen. Theft. Such a convenient accusation. Impossible to disprove. Just serious enough to justify casting her out, but not serious enough to require involving the territorial marshal. A quiet expulsion. A family matter. Clara shifted the flour sack on her shoulder and looked at the smoke one more time. That cabin had been her home for 3 years. She had chinked those walls herself because Robert had never been good with his hands. She had built the furniture inside. She had planted the garden that would feed whoever lived there next spring. 18 months of work wiped away by 3 missing silver dollars and a brother-in-law's greed. She turned north. Fort Benton was 67 miles in that direction, the nearest real settlement. There would be people there building some semblance of civilization. A woman alone might find work in Fort Benton, laundry, cooking, the kind of labor that paid just enough to not starve. But 67 miles was a long walk in November. The Highwood Mountains were already white with early snow. The wind came down from Canada with nothing to stop it. No trees, no hills, just open prairie that might as well have been a frozen ocean. Clara had seen what happened to people who tried to cross that prairie unprepared. She had helped bury 2 of them last winter, a father and son from Ohio, who had miscalculated the distance to the next settlement by 12 miles. 12 miles. Close enough to see the smoke from the chimneys if the weather had been clear. But the weather had not been clear, and they had died within sight of salvation. She was not going to Fort Benton. Instead, Clara turned west. 3 miles in that direction, there was a formation of sandstone cliffs she had noticed during a water haul the previous spring. She had been carrying buckets from the creek, and something had made her look up at those rust-colored walls rising from the prairie, like the ruins of some ancient fortress. The cliffs were honeycombed with alcoves, wind-carved chambers in the rock, some shallow as a dog's bed, others cutting back 30 feet or more into the stone. Most folks avoided that area. It had been Blackfoot hunting ground until recently, and tribal memory ran long in these territories. The white settlers who had pushed the Blackfoot out still looked over their shoulders when they passed. Those sandstone walls still felt the weight of eyes that might or might not be watching. But Clara had grown up in the Scottish Highlands in a village so small it did not appear on most maps. She had watched shepherds weather entire winters in cave shelters carved into hillsides, emerging in spring with their flocks intact, while valley farmers dug out from collapsed roofs and frozen livestock. The principle was simple enough that a child could understand it. Earth held temperature steady when air went wild. 40 feet of rock overhead did not care if the wind hit 50 miles per hour. It did not care if the mercury dropped to 40 below zero. The rock just sat there, massive and indifferent, maintaining its own temperature regardless of what the surface world was doing. Clara had learned this lesson before she was 10 years old. Huddled in a hillside cave with her grandmother while a highland blizzard buried the world outside. Her grandmother had explained the science in simple terms. The earth is warm, child. Not hot like fire, but warm like blood. Go deep enough, and that warmth never changes. Summer or winter, storm or calm. The mountain remembers what the sky forgets. Clara walked west. The flour sack was not heavy, but it grew heavier with each mile. The hardtack pressed against her spine. The wooden comb dug into her shoulder blade. Small discomforts that magnified themselves over distance. The temperature continued to drop as the sun angled toward the horizon. 19 degrees now, maybe 18. Cold enough that her breath made small clouds that hung in the still air before dissipating. She passed the old boundary marker that Robert had set during their first summer on the claim. A pile of stones with a wooden stake driven into the center. The wood had weathered to gray and someone had carved initials into it. R.M. Robert Mercer. her husband's mark on land that was no longer hers. She did not stop to look at it. The sandstone formations appeared on the horizon, just as the sun touched the western mountains. Red gold in the fading light, the cliffs rose maybe 80 feet above the prairie floor, their surfaces carved by 10,000 years of wind into shapes that almost looked intentional. Pillars and arches, hollows and chambers. A cathedral built by erosion and time. Clara approached the base of the formation as twilight settled over the basin. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees. Another hour, and it would be in single digits. Another 2 hours, and she would be dealing with temperatures that could kill an unprepared person in less than 30 minutes. She needed to find shelter quickly. The first alcove she checked was too shallow, maybe 6 feet deep, open to the wind on two sides. The second was deeper but angled wrong, facing north where the worst winds would find her. The third alcove was perfect. It opened to the south, catching whatever winter sun might penetrate the clouds. The entrance was maybe 12 feet wide, narrowing to about 8 feet at the back. The chamber cut back into the rock roughly 22 feet, far enough that the last 5 feet existed in permanent shadow. Clara stepped inside and felt the temperature change immediately. Outside, the air bit at her exposed skin, found the gaps in her clothing, worked its way through the weave of her shawl to the flesh beneath. Inside the cave, the air was still. Not warm exactly, but absent the predatory chill that characterized the open prairie. She walked deeper into the chamber, one hand trailing along the sandstone wall. The rock felt almost neutral to the touch. Not cold like metal or ice, not warm like anything living. Just there, present. Indifferent to her survival, but not actively hostile to it. The ceiling varied from about 7 feet at the entrance to barely 5 at the back. The floor sloped gently upward toward the rear of the chamber, which suited her purposes perfectly. Heat rises. Cold settles. Any shepherd's child knew that. If she slept at the back of the cave at the high point of that sloping floor, she would be sleeping in the warmest air the chamber had to offer. The cold would pool near the entrance, and she would be above it, breathing air that her own body heat had helped to warm. Clara set down her flour sack and stood very still for a moment, letting her senses adjust to this new space. The silence was remarkable. Not the silence of an empty room where small sounds still penetrated from outside. This was deeper than that. The silence of stone. The silence of a space that had existed for millions of years before humans walked this continent, that would exist for millions of years after the last human was gone. She could hear her own heartbeat. She could hear the blood moving through her veins. She could hear mice somewhere in the walls of the cave, tiny creatures going about their business in cracks and crevices invisible to human eyes. And she could hear very faintly the wind beginning to rise outside. That first night, Clara did not sleep so much as endure. She huddled against the back wall of the cave, wrapped in both dresses she owned, one layered over the other. The flour sack served as a pillow. The wooden comb pressed uncomfortably into her hip, but she did not move it. She did not want to move at all. Every adjustment cost body heat, and body heat was currency she could not afford to spend. The coyotes started singing around midnight. Their voices echoed off the sandstone walls, made it sound like there were dozens of them, hundreds maybe, circling the formations in the darkness. Clara knew the sound was exaggerated by the acoustics of the cliffs. But knowing did not make it less unsettling. She had nothing to make fire with, no flint, no steel. Nothing dry enough to catch a spark, even if she had the tools. She simply lay in the darkness, conserving heat, waiting for dawn. And somewhere during those long hours, she noticed something remarkable. The temperature inside the cave was not dropping. Outside, she could hear the wind building to a steady howl. The kind of wind that drove snow horizontally, that found every crack in every cabin wall, that killed livestock, and sometimes people who had simply stepped outside to check on their animals. But inside the cave, in that back chamber where Clara lay curled against the stone, the air remained stable. She could not measure the exact temperature. She did not have a thermometer, and even if she had, the darkness would have made reading it impossible. But she knew cold. She had lived with cold her entire life, first in Scotland, and then here on the Montana frontier. She knew the difference between dangerous cold and merely uncomfortable cold. The air inside the cave was uncomfortable, but not dangerous. She guessed it was somewhere in the mid-40s, cold enough that she could see her breath if there had been light to see by, cold enough that sleep came in fits and starts rather than long restorative stretches, but not cold enough to threaten her life. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 19 degrees below zero. She learned this later from settlers in Utica, who had thermometers and had been watching the mercury with horrified fascination all night. 19 below, with wind chill pushing it past 40 below. Cold enough to freeze exposed skin in under 2 minutes. Cold enough to kill. Inside the cave, Clara was cold, but she was alive. And as the first gray light of dawn began to filter into the chamber, she made her decision. She was not going to Fort Benton. She was not going to Helena to compete with 200 other desperate souls for laundry work that paid 15 cents a day. She was not going to accept charity from churches or rely on the kindness of strangers who might or might not exist. She was going to build something here, in this cave, with her own hands and her own knowledge and whatever materials she could scavenge from a landscape that wanted her dead. She was going to survive the winter, and she was going to do it on her own terms. The first 4 days were devoted to scavenging. Clara had nothing except what she carried in that flour sack, which meant she needed everything: tools, building materials, food, fire-making supplies. The list of necessities stretched to infinity when you started from zero. She began with wood. The creek bottom, a mile from the sandstone formations, was lined with cottonwood trees. Many of them had died over the years, their trunks bleached white by sun and wind, their branches brittle and dry. Perfect firewood. Perfect building material. But cottonwood is heavy when you are carrying it by hand, and a mile is a long distance when you are making multiple trips per day. Clara did the math. Each piece of wood she could reasonably carry weighed maybe 30 pounds. She could make 3 trips per day without exhausting herself. That was 90 pounds of wood per day minus whatever she burned each night to stay warm. At that rate, she would never accumulate enough material to build anything substantial. So she changed her approach. Instead of carrying individual pieces, she began dragging larger sections. Dead branches 12 and 15 feet long, bumping and scraping across the frozen ground, catching on rocks and sage, and every other obstacle the prairie could provide. Slower going, but more material per trip. She dragged cottonwood up that hill until her shoulders screamed and her hands cracked and bled from the cold and the rough bark. She piled it near the cave entrance, sorting pieces by size and shape. long straight sections that might serve as structural poles, shorter pieces for fuel, curved branches that could be lashed together for other purposes. On the second day, she found the abandoned line shack. It was 2 miles south of her cave, a remnant from the railroad survey of '71. The surveyors had built it for temporary shelter, then abandoned it when their work was done. 5 years of Montana weather had reduced it to a sagging skeleton of boards and tar paper. Clara approached it carefully. Abandoned structures on the frontier were unpredictable. Sometimes they sheltered rattlesnakes or skunks or other creatures that did not appreciate visitors. Sometimes they had simply rotted to the point of collapse, ready to fall on anyone foolish enough to step inside. This shack was dying, but not yet dead. She pulled 10 boards from its collapsing walls, working quickly as the structure groaned and shifted around her. Good boards, milled lumber from somewhere back east, shipped out for the railroad and left behind when the survey ended. Worth their weight in gold to a woman building shelter from nothing. She had retrieved the 8th board when the shack gave up entirely. The remaining walls folded inward with a sound like a giant exhalation, and the roof came down in a cascade of tar paper and broken timber. Clara stood 10 feet away, breathing hard, watching 5 years of weather finally win its battle against human construction. If she had been inside when it collapsed, she would be dead now. Pinned under debris, unable to free herself, slowly freezing as the November day faded to November night. She collected the boards she had salvaged and went back to searching the wreckage. From the ruins of that line shack, she recovered 6 feet of rusted chain, 3 bent nails, a cracked shovel blade that could still dig if you did not mind blisters, a length of wire that might once have held a lantern. Small treasures, worthless by the standards of civilization. But Clara was not in civilization anymore. She was somewhere older than that, where the value of things was measured by how they helped you survive until tomorrow. On the 5th day, a freight wagon appeared on the Carroll Trail. Clara had been hauling wood when she heard the creak of wheels and the jingle of harness. She straightened up, pushing hair from her face, suddenly aware of how she must look. 4 days without proper washing, clothes stiff with dried sweat and wood dust, hands raw and bleeding from work she had never done before. The freighter was a big man with a red beard and eyes that had seen too much. He stopped his wagon when he saw her, though, whether from curiosity or concern, she could not tell. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Clara saw a man who made his living hauling goods between settlements, risking his life on roads that barely deserved the name, surviving blizzards and bandits and the 1,000 small disasters that plagued overland commerce. A practical man, a survivor. The freighter saw a woman alone near the sandstone formations, surrounded by piles of scavenged wood, obviously preparing for something. What that something might be, he clearly could not imagine. Clara spoke first. She asked if he had tools to trade. Anything at all. She could pay. She did not have money, but she had something that might interest him. She showed him the wedding ring. It was a simple gold band worn thin by years of use, inscribed on the inside with initials that no longer mattered. RM to CD, Robert Mercer to Clara Douglas. A promise made 15 years ago in a church in Boston, kept until death did them part in a frozen Montana forest. The freighter looked at the ring for a long time. Then he looked at Clara. Then he looked at the sandstone formations rising behind her, at the alcove entrance visible 50 yards away. He understood what she was planning. She could see the comprehension in his eyes, followed immediately by certainty that she would fail. The tools he had were poor. A handsaw with 7 broken teeth, a hammer missing half its handle, a tarp so full of holes it was more hole than tarp. He apologized for the quality, though they both knew he was really apologizing for the exchange rate. Her wedding ring was worth $20 in any settlement. These tools were worth maybe 3. Clara made the trade anyway. As she gathered up her new possessions, the freighter spoke one more time. His voice was not unkind. "Winter is coming hard this year, ma'am. That ring could have bought you passage to Helena, a room in a boarding house, a chance to start over somewhere warm." Clara looked at him. She did not smile, but something in her expression must have unsettled him because he took a step back toward his wagon. She said Helena meant starting over with nothing. Helena meant charity houses and competition for work that paid 15 cents a day. Helena meant depending on the kindness of people who owed her nothing. This cave was not charity. The freighter left without another word. Clara watched his wagon until it disappeared over a rise in the trail, the sound of wheels fading into the vast silence of the prairie. Then she picked up her broken tools and went back to work. By November 28th, Clara had constructed a front wall for the cave. It was not fancy. Vertical cottonwood poles set 18 inches apart, gaps chinked with clay from the creek bank, mixed with dried grass. The whole structure braced by horizontal stringers, lashed with strips cut from her husband's old leather belt. She left a doorway on the south side 3 feet wide, covered it with the tarp weighted by rocks along the bottom edge. Not a proper door, but it blocked the wind, and blocking the wind was more important than aesthetics. But one wall was not enough. Clara had watched her grandmother build winter shelters in the Highland caves. One wall stopped the wind, but wind was only half the problem. The other half was heat loss through convection. Air currents that carried warm air out and brought cold air in, constantly cycling the temperature toward equilibrium with the outside world. Her grandmother's solution had been elegant in its simplicity. 2 walls, an outer wall to stop the wind and an inner wall 8 feet behind it. The space between the walls created a dead air zone, a buffer that trapped heat. The way still water holds warmth better than moving water. Clara built that second wall. It took 3 more days of work. More cottonwood poles. More clay and grass chinked into every gap. Another doorway offset from the first so that air could not flow straight through. The result divided the cave into 3 zones. The front zone between the outer wall and the inner wall would be the coldest. Wind could still penetrate there, though weakened. Cold air would settle there, trapped between the walls, insulating the spaces behind. The middle zone between the inner wall and the rear of the cave would be warmer. This was where she would spend her days, where she would work and cook and exist. The rear zone, the last 5 feet of the chamber where the ceiling dropped to 5 feet, and the floor rose to its highest point, would be warmest of all. This was where she would sleep. Her body heat would accumulate there overnight, trapped by the low ceiling, warmed by the rising air that sought the highest point of the space. The fire pit was her grandmother's solution too. Clara dug 18 inches into the cave floor near the entrance, lined the hole with flat stones collected from the creek bed. Then she built a chimney from stacked rocks and clay, angling it along the cave ceiling so that smoke would be drawn toward the entrance and out through a gap she had left at the top of her outer wall. The principle was the same one the Romans had used 2,000 years ago, the same one Highland shepherds had used for centuries. Fire heats stones. Stones hold heat. Long after the fire dies, the stones continue radiating warmth into the space. She had watched this system work in her grandmother's cave. One good fire banked with hardwood coals could keep the stones warm for 8 or 9 hours. All night, in other words. You went to sleep with dying embers and woke to a space that was still comfortable, still survivable, while the world outside froze solid. The first fire she lit in that pit burned unevenly. Too much air from one direction, not enough from another. Smoke leaked into the living space before being drawn toward the chimney. Clara spent an hour adjusting the stone arrangement, widening a gap here, closing one there, until the airflow finally stabilized. By midnight, the fire had burned down to coals. Clara banked them with ash, went to the rear chamber, and lay down to sleep. When she woke 7 hours later, the stones were still warm. The rear chamber had held at perhaps 50 degrees all night. Not comfortable by the standards of a heated home, but comfortable enough to sleep without constant shivering. Comfortable enough to wake rested, rather than exhausted. She had done it. She had built a functional shelter from nothing except scavenged materials, and the knowledge her grandmother had given her 50 years ago in a different country, on a different continent, in a different life entirely. Clara stood in the entrance of her cave that morning and looked out at the frost-covered prairie. The temperature was maybe 5 degrees. The wind had died overnight, leaving the landscape still and glittering in the early sun. Smoke rose from her chimney in a thin gray line, just like the smoke from Henry's chimney, the smoke from the home that had thrown her out like garbage. But this smoke was different. This smoke was hers. She had built the fire that made it. She had constructed the chimney that carried it into the sky. Every piece of wood, every stone, every handful of clay and dried grass represented hours of work and miles of walking and skin-worn raw from labor. This was not charity. This was earned. The settlement at Utica was 12 miles east. Word traveled slowly in the Montana Territory, but it traveled. By the second week of December, people had heard about the woman living in a cave near the sandstone formations. Most folks did not know what to make of it. A woman alone was unusual enough. A woman alone who had chosen cave dwelling over the relative safety of a settlement was something else entirely. Eccentric at best, insane at worst. Certainly unsuitable for polite company. Samuel Hendricks rode out to see her on a gray December afternoon. Big Tom, people called him, though he was not particularly big. He had homesteaded this region in '68, survived 2 winters that had killed men stronger and more prepared than him. His opinion carried weight in the basin. He found Clara splitting wood outside her cave entrance. She had rigged up a makeshift chopping block from a cottonwood stump, and she was working through a pile of branches with methodical efficiency. Split, stack, split, stack. The rhythm of survival. Samuel watched her work for a minute before speaking. When he did speak, his voice carried the flat certainty of a man who had seen too much death to sugarcoat his assessments. You are living in a hole in the ground with winter coming on. I have seen what happens when folks get creative about shelter. Found the Peterson family in March of '71. All 4 of them frozen in their dugout when their ventilation plugged with snow. Clara did not stop splitting wood. She acknowledged his presence with a slight nod. but kept her rhythm going. Split, stack, split, stack. Samuel moved closer, studying the cave entrance, the chimney arrangement, the double wall system visible through the tarp-covered doorway. Rock does not burn like wood, he continued, but it does not breathe either. You get sealed in there with a fire going, the smoke will kill you before the cold does. Clara finally paused. She set down her axe and turned to face him, and something in her expression made Samuel take a half step backward. Not fear exactly, more like surprise. He had expected to find a desperate woman clinging to a bad decision. Instead, he found someone who looked at him with the calm certainty of a person who had already done the calculations he was trying to explain. She thanked him for his concern. Her voice was polite but firm. She understood the risks he was describing. She had built her ventilation system to address exactly those concerns. The chimney drew air from outside, heated it over the fire pit, and exhausted the smoke along the ceiling and out through a gap at the entrance. Would he like to see it? Samuel hesitated. He had come here to deliver a warning, possibly to convince her to abandon this foolishness before it killed her. He had not expected an invitation for a technical tour, but curiosity won out over caution. He followed her inside. What he saw surprised him. The double wall system with its dead air buffer, the fire pit with its gravity-fed ventilation, the sleeping platform at the rear where heat accumulated naturally due to the sloped floor and low ceiling, the storage areas organized with military precision. This was not the desperate improvisation of a woman who had run out of options. This was designed, planned, built according to principles that Samuel did not fully understand, but could see were working. The temperature inside the cave was maybe 45 degrees. Outside, it was 12. That differential did not happen by accident. Samuel spent 20 minutes examining the setup. He asked questions. Where had she learned this? How long had it taken to build? What were the limitations? Clara answered patiently. She showed him the stones that held heat overnight. She explained the double wall concept. She described the temperature monitoring she had been doing, tracking how the cave responded to different weather conditions. By the time Samuel left, his assessment had changed. He still thought she was taking a significant risk. He still believed there were safer options, but he no longer thought she was crazy. And he told other people that. Over drinks at the Mercantile in Utica, over meals with neighboring homesteaders, and conversations with travelers passing through. The woman in the cave knows what she is doing. Strange choice, but not a stupid one. Might actually work. Father Thomas Brennan came a week later. He was a young priest new to the territory, still carrying the soft hands and certain faith of seminary training. He had heard about Clara from his parishioners, and he felt obligated to offer assistance. What he found disturbed him on a level that had nothing to do with physical survival. "My child," he said, standing in the entrance of her cave, "this is not shelter. This is desperation. A woman alone in a cave 3 miles from the nearest Christian soul." Clara was working on improving her food storage system. She had discovered that the deep rear section of the cave maintained an almost constant 45 degrees, perfect for keeping vegetables and dried meat from spoiling. She was building a raised platform to keep her supplies off the damp floor. Father Brennan watched her work as he spoke. His voice carried genuine concern beneath the religious framing. "I have buried 17 souls in this territory since August. Most of them had better shelter than this. There is no shame in accepting help from the church. We have resources. We have community. We have warmth that does not require living like an animal in a hole. Clara finally looked up from her work. She thanked him for coming. She appreciated his concern. She understood that he was offering help from a place of genuine caring, but she was not living like an animal. She was living like a person who had been forced to choose between dependence and self-reliance, between charity and dignity. She had chosen dignity, and she was warm. Her cave stayed between 45 and 50 degrees, while the outside temperature fluctuated from 10 above to 20 below. She had food. She had fire. She had shelter that would not blow down in a storm or collapse under snow. What she did not have was company. But company had betrayed her. Company had thrown her out with nothing when a man's greed mattered more than a woman's innocence. Perhaps she suggested Father Brennan could pray for her. That seemed like something the church might offer, without requiring her to give up everything she had built. The priest left an hour later. He did not look happy, but he did not push further. December deepened into the kind of cold that had weight and presence that filled every unprotected space, like water filling a vessel. Clara continued her work. She improved the fire pit system, adding a second ring of stones that could be heated, and then moved to the sleeping area, providing localized warmth during the coldest nights. She expanded her wood supply until the front chamber was stacked waist-high with split cottonwood. She experimented with different insulation materials for the walls, finding that dried grass mixed with cottonwood bark worked better than clay alone. Each improvement was small. Each improvement was hard-won. Each improvement represented another step away from the woman she had been when Henry Mercer threw her out with $3 silver worth of lies. On the last night of December, Clara stood in the entrance of her cave and watched the stars wheel overhead. The temperature was 15 below zero. The wind was calm. The prairie stretched away in all directions, silver and shadow under a moon just past full. From somewhere in the Highwood Mountains, 15 miles away, she could hear wolves calling to each other. Their voices carried perfectly in the still air a reminder that she was not alone in this landscape, that other creatures were out there, surviving the same cold in their own ways. She thought about Margaret, about Henry, about the cabin that used to be her home. She thought about the smoke rising from that chimney on the day they had cast her out. How peaceful it had looked. How false that peace had been. She thought about her grandmother in Scotland teaching a little girl about caves and survival, and the warmth that stone could hold. She thought about Robert frozen against a cottonwood trunk, because he had trusted his own judgment more than he should have. And she thought about the spring that was coming, still 4 months away, still separated from this moment by an ocean of cold and darkness and difficulty, but coming nonetheless. She would be here when it arrived. She would be alive. She would be strong. She would have built something from nothing with her own hands, and her own knowledge and her own stubborn refusal to die just because the world expected her to. The cave was warm behind her. The fire pit stones were radiating heat they had absorbed hours ago. Her sleeping platform waited in the rear chamber, raised above the cold floor, positioned where the warmest air naturally accumulated. Outside, the temperature would continue to fall until it bottomed out around 3 in the morning at maybe 25 below. Cold enough to freeze exposed flesh in 60 seconds. Cold enough to kill anyone caught in the open without shelter. But Clara would not be in the open. She would be inside her cave, inside her walls, inside the shelter she had built from cottonwood and clay, and the wisdom of a grandmother dead 30 years now. She had been thrown out before winter. She had built a cabin in the cave. And she was going to survive. December came down from the north like an invading army. The temperature dropped below zero on the 8th and stayed there for 6 consecutive days. Not the kind of cold that made you uncomfortable. The kind of cold that made you dead if you miscalculated anything at all. Clara woke each morning in the back of her cave, where the air held steady at 51 degrees. She would lie there for a moment, wrapped in her blankets, feeling the relative warmth of that rear chamber press against her skin like a promise kept. Then she would rise and walk forward through her shelter, moving through the temperature zone she had created. The middle chamber between her inner and outer walls held at 44 degrees. Residual heat from the previous night's fire pit. Stones kept it there, radiating warmth long after the flames had died to ash. The front chamber between the outer wall and the cave entrance was colder, maybe 38 degrees. Cold enough that her breath made clouds, but warm enough to work without gloves. Warm enough to think clearly. Then she would push aside the tarp covering the entrance and step outside into air so cold it turned her breath to ice crystals before they could rise. 19 below zero, 22 below, 27 below. The differential was staggering. Inside her cave, life was possible. Uncomfortable, but possible. She could work, think, plan, survive. Outside, death waited with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. Clara began to understand something during those December days. Something about the relationship between effort and survival that she had never fully grasped before. Every piece of wood she had dragged up that hill was paying dividends now. Every stone she had carried from the creek, every handful of clay she had mixed with dried grass to chink the gaps in her walls. All of that labor performed during the relatively mild days of late November was keeping her alive now that the real cold had arrived. Survival was not something that happened in the moment of crisis. Survival was something you prepared for in advance, or you did not survive at all. The fire pit system worked better than she had hoped. One good burn each evening using the driest cottonwood she had, feeding the flames until the stones glowed orange with absorbed heat. Then, she would bank the fire with ash, reducing it to embers that would continue radiating warmth for another hour or two. The stones themselves would stay warm for 8 or 9 hours, slowly releasing their stored heat into the cave air. She had insulated the rear sleeping chamber by hanging her tarp as a secondary ceiling, creating a pocket of trapped air between the tarp and the stone above. That simple addition raised the temperature another 4 degrees. Small numbers that meant the difference between sleeping and shivering. Condensation from her breathing froze on the tarp's underside during the coldest nights, forming a thin layer of frost that she scraped off each morning and melted for washing water. Nothing wasted. Her grandmother had taught her that principle in a different language, a different century, but it crossed oceans and decades without losing any of its truth. Food was the harder problem. Clara had managed to trade work for supplies in Utica during the milder days of early December. Mucking stables, hauling water, jobs that paid in flour and salt pork rather than cash. She had set snares along the creek, caught 3 rabbits in 2 weeks. Not enough. A woman needed 2,000 calories minimum to maintain weight during hard winter labor. The rabbits gave her maybe 600 calories total. The flour and salt pork would last through January if she rationed carefully, maybe into early February. After that, things would get interesting. But she would solve that problem when she reached it. Right now, the immediate challenge was staying warm enough to function. And she was meeting that challenge every single day. The cave's thermal properties would have pleased an engineer. The sandstone absorbed heat during the day, not from sunlight which barely penetrated past the entrance, but from her fire pit, and from her own body heat in the sealed rear chamber. The stone acted as a massive thermal battery, charging during the warmer periods and discharging slowly overnight. The result was maybe 3 degrees of temperature swing inside the cave, compared to the 40-degree swings that folks in Utica dealt with in their wooden cabins. 3 degrees meant the difference between waking comfortable and waking to frozen water buckets. It meant being able to work inside without constantly fighting shivers that made fine motor control impossible. But temperature regulation was only one thing the cave offered. The other thing was silence. Not the quiet of an empty room where small sounds still penetrated from outside. This was profound silence. The absence of wind noise that defined every wooden structure on the Montana frontier. 20 feet back from the entrance, sound dampened to nothing. Clara could hear her own heartbeat. She could hear mice moving through cracks in the stone walls. She could hear on still nights wolves howling in the highwood peaks 15 miles away, their voices carrying across the frozen prairie with perfect clarity. The silence became its own comfort, a reminder that she had built something solid enough to exclude the chaos outside. Stone did not creak in the wind. Stone did not rattle when gusts hit 50 miles per hour. Stone just sat there massive and ancient, doing what it had done for 10 million years before humans arrived, and would continue doing for 10 million years after humans were gone. Clara began to feel something she had not expected to feel in this place of exile and desperation. Peace. Eric Lindquist arrived on December 19th. Clara was working near the cave entrance, splitting wood for the evening fire, when she heard footsteps crunching through the frozen snow. She straightened up, one hand moving automatically toward the small knife she kept at her belt. The man who emerged from the afternoon shadows was tall and thin, with the raw-boned look of someone who had missed too many meals recently. His beard was unkempt. His clothes were damp despite the cold, and his eyes had the particular hollow expression of a person who had run out of good options. He stopped 20 feet from the cave entrance and raised both hands, showing they were empty. Swedish accent, thick enough that Clara had to listen carefully to parse his words. He apologized for intruding. He had heard there was a woman living in these rocks, living in a cave that stayed warm when other shelters failed. He was wondering if perhaps she might allow him to rest here for one night. Just one night. He would pay or work or whatever she required. Clara studied him for a long moment. She had learned to read people during her years on the frontier. This man was not dangerous. He was desperate, which was different. Dangerous men projected threat. Desperate men projected need. This one needed something badly enough to approach a stranger's shelter in December and beg for entry. She asked what had happened to his own shelter. The story came out in fragments, punctuated by shivers that the man could not control. His name was Eric Lindquist. He had come from Minnesota 2 years ago, filed a homestead claim 4 miles south, built a cabin using railroad ties from the survey depot, paid $17 for a sheet metal stove from Helena, done everything by the book. But the book had not mentioned that clay chinked into wall gaps would crack when it dried. Had not mentioned that a metal roof over a heated space would cause snow to melt, run down to the eaves and refreeze into ice dams that directed meltwater straight through the walls. Had not mentioned that damp firewood produced more smoke than heat, that wet blankets could not be dried when the air itself was saturated with moisture. For 3 nights, Eric had tried to sleep in his cabin, each night worse than the one before, everything damp. The stove consuming fuel at an unsustainable rate, smoke making his eyes water and his lungs burn. He had heard about the cave woman from a freighter passing through, had decided that whatever pride might be lost by asking a stranger for help was worth less than his life. Clara made her decision. She stepped aside and gestured toward the entrance. One night, she said, the front chamber only. He would contribute firewood tomorrow as payment. Eric Lindquist almost collapsed with relief. That first night he slept in the front chamber of Clara's cave, between the outer wall and the inner wall. The coldest part of her shelter, still maybe 38 degrees, still warmer than anything he had experienced in a week. He woke the next morning dry for the first time in 4 days. Dry. Such a simple thing. Such an impossible thing when your shelter had failed and the world outside was 20 below zero. Clara was already up when he woke, tending the fire pit, preparing a simple breakfast of hardtack, softened in hot water. She did not look at him, did not acknowledge his presence beyond a slight nod. But she had set aside a portion of food for him without being asked. Eric sat up slowly, his body aching from the deep cold that had penetrated his bones over the past week. He looked around the cave with new eyes. In the dim morning light filtering through gaps in the outer wall, he could see what Clara had built here. The double wall system with its dead air buffer, the fire pit with stone still warm from the previous night's burn, the organized storage areas, the sleeping platform in the rear chamber raised 8 inches off the floor on a frame of cottonwood branches. But what caught his attention most was the firewood, stacks of it along the front chamber walls. Split cottonwood, properly seasoned, completely dry. In his own cabin, Eric had struggled to keep any wood dry enough to burn properly. The constant moisture from his leaking roof had saturated everything. Here, the wood was perfect, because the cave's humidity stayed constant at about 40%. Because the stone walls did not sweat or leak, because Clara had understood something about this environment that Eric had never even considered. He asked if he could stay another night. Clara said yes, but the payment would be higher. Firewood and help improving the door system. Her tarp covering was adequate, but not ideal. Eric agreed immediately. He stayed that night, and the next, and the night after that. On the 4th night, he brought his tools from his failed cabin and asked if Clara would mind if he improved her door system. He was a fair carpenter when he had proper materials to work with. He could build a real door frame with a door that actually closed and sealed. Clara said she would not mind. By Christmas, Eric had constructed a proper door frame with iron hinges salvaged from his cabin stove. He had reinforced her inner wall with additional bracing. He had built a sleeping platform in the rear chamber that kept them 8 inches off the cold floor, raised on legs he had carved from cottonwood branches. He had also, without quite meaning to, begun referring to the space as our cave. Clara noticed this shift in language. She did not correct it. She was not entirely sure what was happening between them. It was not romance, not in the way young people experienced romance. They were both too old for that, too marked by loss and hardship, to pretend that attraction alone could sustain a partnership. What they had was something else, something more practical, and perhaps more durable. Mutual respect, complementary skills, a shared understanding that survival on this frontier was easier with two than with one. Eric worked hard. He did not complain. He split firewood with an efficiency Clara could not match, his long arms and broad shoulders generating power that her smaller frame could not replicate. He also had resources she lacked. His homestead claim was still valid, which meant he had legal access to supplies and materials that Clara could only scavenge. The railroad ties from his failed cabin, the sheet metal stove that could be relocated, tools and implements accumulated over 2 years of frontier living. In exchange, Clara offered something equally valuable: knowledge. She taught him about thermal mass, about dead air spaces and their insulating properties, about the principle of heating stones and letting them radiate warmth long after the fire died, about the importance of humidity control, of ventilation, of understanding how heat moved through a space, rather than simply generating more heat and hoping for the best. Eric listened to these lessons with the intensity of a man who had nearly died from ignorance and was determined not to make the same mistakes twice. They divided the cave into separate spaces because propriety mattered even in survival situations. Eric slept in the middle chamber. Clara slept in the rear. They shared meals and labor, but maintained the formal distance appropriate to two unmarried people living in close quarters. The settlement at Utica developed opinions about this arrangement. Some folks thought it was scandalous. A woman and a man living together unwed, even if they claimed to maintain separate sleeping areas. The frontier had standards, they argued. Christian standards. Civilization did not survive by abandoning propriety. Other folks were more pragmatic. The frontier killed people who put propriety above survival. If sharing a cave kept two people alive through the winter, then the cave sharing was a good thing, regardless of what anyone's grandmother might have thought about it. Samuel Hendricks, who had warned Clara about the Peterson family, fell into the pragmatic camp. He had watched Clara's shelter through the early December cold snap, had heard reports from the freighters who passed through, had done his own assessment of the temperature differentials she was maintaining. By mid-December, his opinion had evolved. If you get caught between here and Utica after dark, he began telling travelers, head for the Mercer Cave. 3 miles west, sandstone formations, you cannot miss it. Warmest shelter between Fort Benton and Helena. I will fight anyone who says different. Father Thomas Brennan evolved more slowly, but he evolved. He visited the cave again in late December, found Clara and Eric working together on a storage system for their combined food supplies. He watched them interact, noting the mutual respect, the easy cooperation, the complete absence of the desperation he had seen during his first visit. This is not what I expected to find, he admitted. Clara asked what he had expected. 2 people slowly freezing to death while pretending their situation was sustainable. Instead, I find something that looks almost comfortable. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I would still prefer you were in town under proper shelter within reach of the church's support. But I can no longer call this desperation. What would he call it? Father Brennan thought for a moment. An innovative application of old-world principles to new-world challenges. Clara allowed herself a small smile. That was priest talk for admitting he had been wrong without quite saying so directly. She would take it. The real test came on December 19th. Eric had gone to Utica that morning to purchase supplies. The weather had been cold but manageable for 2 weeks. Daytime temperatures around 18 degrees, nights dropping to maybe 5 below. Unpleasant but survivable. He should have been back by noon. By 1 in the afternoon, Clara began watching the horizon. By 2, she noticed the sky changing. That particular shade of yellow-gray that meant serious trouble was coming. Barometric pressure dropping. Temperature already falling faster than it should. By 3, it was snowing. Not the gentle snow of a normal winter day, but horizontal snow driven by wind that had come from nowhere and was building with every passing minute. By 4, visibility had dropped to maybe 6 feet. The temperature had crashed to 11 below zero and was still falling. Wind gusts were hitting 40 miles per hour, driving the wind chill down past any number Clara wanted to calculate. Eric was still not back. Clara stood at the cave entrance, wrapped in every layer she owned, watching the world disappear into white static. She ran calculations in her head. 12 miles to Utica. If Eric had left at noon, he would be roughly halfway home by now. If he had left at 1, he would be about 8 miles out. If he had waited in town for the storm to pass, he would be safe in Utica, and she would be alone with her worry. But Eric was not the waiting type. Eric was the type to trust his own strength and navigation skills. The type who figured he could push through weather that would stop lesser men. The type who had tried to winter in a railroad tie cabin and ended up sleeping in someone else's cave because his confidence had exceeded his competence. Clara made her decision at 6 in the evening. She could not go looking for him, not in this weather. Not with visibility measured in feet, and temperatures that would kill her in 30 minutes if she became disoriented. Going out there would not save Eric. It would just add another body to whatever count this storm was accumulating. But she could prepare. She built up the fire pit until the stones glowed orange, hung extra tarps across the entrance to create a windbreak, set water to heat for coffee, for washing, for whatever medical purposes might be required. Then, she walked to the entrance and started listening. Between wind gusts in those brief moments when the howling dropped to something less than deafening, she listened for anything that sounded like human movement. Footsteps, voices, the jingle of horse tack, nothing. For an hour, nothing. Then at 7 o'clock she heard the horse, not clearly. The wind was still gusting, still filling the world with white noise. But there was something underneath that noise, a rhythm that did not match the storm's chaos. Hoofbeats, maybe, or something being dragged through snow. Clara grabbed a lantern and stepped outside. The cold hit her like a physical blow. Wind chill was pushing 60 below now. Cold enough to freeze exposed skin in under 2 minutes. Cold enough to kill anyone caught in the open without shelter. She held the lantern high and walked toward the sound. 30 yards from the cave entrance, she found them. The horse had walked straight into the sandstone formation and stopped. It could not go forward because there was solid rock in front of it. It was too exhausted to turn back. It just stood there, head down, snow accumulating on its back, waiting to die. Eric was still in the saddle. His hands were frozen to the reins. His fingers locked in a grip he could no longer release. His face was covered in ice from his own breath, each exhalation freezing before it could disperse. His eyes were closed. For a terrible moment, Clara thought he was dead. Then she saw his chest move, slight shallow but movement. She got him down from the horse, 180 pounds of unconscious weight, frozen stiff, completely unresponsive. She could not carry him. She could barely move him. But she got her arms under his shoulders and began dragging him toward the cave entrance. 30 yards. Might as well have been 30 miles. Every step was a battle against wind that tried to knock her down against cold. That was attacking her own body now against the weight of a man who could not help himself at all. She counted steps because counting gave her something to focus on. 10 steps, 20 steps. Her arms were screaming. Her lungs were burning from the cold air. 25 steps. At step 32, she reached the cave entrance. She dragged Eric inside past the windbreak tarps into the relative warmth of the front chamber. Then she went back for the horse. Leaving an animal to freeze was unthinkable. It violated every principle of frontier survival that Clara had absorbed during her years in this country. You did not waste resources. You did not let useful things die when you could save them. Also, that horse represented 3 months' wages. Eric would need it come spring. Getting the horse inside was almost harder than getting Eric. The animal did not want to move. It had given up. But Clara talked to it, pulled at its bridle, eventually got it walking forward into the cave entrance. The front chamber was crowded now. One unconscious man, one exhausted horse, one woman who had used up almost all her reserves getting them both inside. Clara allowed herself 60 seconds to rest, 60 seconds to catch her breath, to let her heart rate come down from dangerous levels, to feel the cave's relative warmth begin penetrating her frozen clothing. Then she went to work. She cut away Eric's boots with her knife. The leather had frozen stiff as iron, impossible to remove any other way. Under the leather, his feet were white and waxy. Classic frostbite. The blood had retreated from his extremities to protect his core, leaving the tissue in his feet and hands frozen. Clara knew what happened when you try to warm frozen flesh too quickly. The ice crystals in the tissue would melt suddenly, rupturing cell walls, destroying tissue that might have been saved with proper treatment. She had seen men lose entire limbs because someone had shoved their frozen hands directly into hot water, thinking they were helping. Her grandmother had taught her the correct approach decades ago, in a highland village where frostbite was a regular winter occurrence. She wrapped Eric's feet and hands in cloth soaked in cool water. Not warm. Cool. Then she placed those wrapped extremities near the fire pit, close enough to warm, gradually far enough to prevent rapid temperature change. Over the next 3 hours, she would change those cloths every 30 minutes each time, using water slightly warmer than before, allowing the frozen tissue to thaw at a rate slow enough that the cells could survive the transition. She kept Eric wrapped in dry blankets, but away from the fire pit's direct heat. His core temperature needed to come up, but slowly. Too fast, and his heart could go into arrhythmia from the shock. Around midnight, he regained consciousness. He came back, fighting. His eyes snapped open. His arms swung wildly, and he nearly knocked Clara across the chamber before she could restrain him. He was delirious. Did not know where he was. Did not recognize her. He shouted something in Swedish, then something in English that made no sense. Then went quiet again. Clara forced warm broth down his throat, a little at a time. He fought her at first, then accepted it, then seemed to realize who she was and where he was. He tried to speak, but she told him to be quiet. Save his strength. The talking could wait until morning. The storm lasted 3 days. Outside, temperatures bottomed out at 41 below zero. Wind sustained at 45 miles per hour, with gusts approaching 70. Wind chill somewhere past 90 below. Cold enough to freeze exposed skin in under 2 minutes. Cold enough to kill livestock where they stood. Cold enough to kill people in their cabins if the fire went out for even an hour. Inside the cave, Clara maintained her routines. She fed the fire pit twice daily, loading it with dry cottonwood, letting the stones absorb as much heat as they could hold. She changed the cloths on Eric's extremities, tracking the slow return of color to his flesh. She fed and watered the horse, which had recovered from its ordeal faster than its rider. Eric could feel his fingers again by the second day, which meant the frostbite was first degree. Painful but recoverable. His feet took longer. The toes had been exposed more severely, frozen more deeply. By the third day, Clara knew he would lose some toes. 2 of them, she estimated, the smallest ones on each foot. They had turned black, the tissue dead beyond any possibility of recovery. But he would walk. He would work. He would survive. When the storm finally broke on the 4th day, Clara stepped outside to survey the aftermath. The landscape had been transformed. Snow had drifted into waves 10 feet high in some places, while other areas were scoured down to bare, frozen earth. The wind had carved the prairie into something that looked like a frozen ocean, all peaks and troughs and impossible angles. She learned later what the storm had cost. In Utica, 7 people had died. 2 from carbon monoxide poisoning when they sealed their cabin too tight trying to keep warm. 3 from freezing when their fuel ran out. 2 from hypothermia when they tried to reach neighbors and got disoriented in ground blizzards. The death toll was light compared to some winters. The winter of 71 had killed 43 people in the same region. But 7 families still buried someone they loved because shelter had failed when it mattered most. Clara's cave had not failed, and people noticed. Word spread fast after the January blizzard. By mid-February, Clara was getting visitors who were not frozen freighters or desperate travelers. They were settlers who wanted to see how cave dwelling worked, wanted to measure the temperature differentials, wanted to understand the fire pit stone heating principle. William Crane arrived on a gray February afternoon. He was a Dutch engineer working for the Montana Central Railway. Educated in Amsterdam, experienced in the kind of practical problem-solving that built railroads across impossible terrain. He had heard about the cave from Samuel Hendricks and had ridden out specifically to examine it. Clara watched him work for 2 hours. He measured temperatures with instruments she had never seen. He sketched her fire pit system in a leather notebook, drawing careful diagrams of the stone arrangement, the chimney angle, the ventilation gaps. He asked questions about airflow and thermal mass and humidity control. Finally, he looked up from his notebook and spoke. "This is brilliant. Simple, but brilliant. You are using thermal mass storage with gravity-fed ventilation. The Romans did this 2,000 years ago with their hypocaust systems. Worked in Rome. Works in Montana. Same physics." Clara did not know what a hypocaust was, but she understood the principle he was describing. Heat stone let stone radiate heat. It was not complicated. It was just observation turned into practice. Crane asked permission to share the design with other homesteaders. Clara shrugged. "Knowledge is not property. Use it if it helps." The design did help. By late February, 4 other families in the Judith Basin had modified their shelters using principles Clara had demonstrated. The Johnson family dug a root cellar beneath their cabin and moved into it, abandoning the drafty structure above for the thermal stability below. They gained 12 degrees of temperature stability instantly. The Chen family Chinese railroad workers turned homesteaders built a second interior wall in their existing cabin, creating a dead air space like the one Clara had built between her cave walls. Their firewood consumption dropped 40%. Old Hans Müller, a German stonemason, who should have known better than anyone how to work with heat and stone, constructed a fire pit system identical to Clara's. His wife's rheumatism improved within a week from sleeping in steady temperatures instead of the wild swings of a poorly insulated cabin. None of them called it the Mercer system or gave Clara any formal credit. That was not how knowledge moved on the frontier. People saw what worked, copied it, adapted it to their own circumstances. The origin mattered less than the function. But Clara knew, and knowing was enough. Eric healed slowly through February. He lost 2 toes, as Clara had predicted. The smallest ones removed by a doctor in Utica who charged $5 for the procedure and gave Eric a bottle of whiskey for the pain. Not unusual for Montana winters. Plenty of settlers were missing fingers or toes or larger pieces. The cold took what it wanted, and you either accepted the loss or you died whole. Eric accepted the loss. He walked with a slight limp at first, favoring the foot that had lost more tissue. By late February, the limp was barely noticeable. By early March, it was gone entirely. He had been living in Clara's cave for almost 3 months now. The arrangement had evolved without either of them quite planning it. Separate sleeping areas, yes. Propriety maintained. But everything else was shared. Meals, labor, supplies, the thousands small decisions that made up daily life. They had developed a rhythm together. Clara Rose first tended the fire pit, started breakfast. Eric Rose second fed the horse, checked their water supply. They worked through the day on whatever needed doing, ate dinner together, then retired to their separate spaces as darkness fell. It was a good rhythm, sustainable, almost comfortable. Eric brought up the future on a cold evening in late February. They were sitting in the middle chamber near the fire pit, watching the stones glow with absorbed heat. Outside, the temperature was 15 below. Inside, it was warm enough that Clara had removed her outer shawl. He had been thinking, Eric said, about spring, about what would happen when the snow melted and the world became passable again. Clara waited for him to continue. His homestead claim was still valid. The cabin was damaged but repairable. He had tools and materials and enough supplies to start fresh. The question was whether he would be starting fresh alone or with company. Clara understood what he was asking. She also understood what he was not asking. He was not asking about love, not asking about romance or attraction, or any of the things that young people asked about when they discuss marriage. Those things were luxuries available to people who had the security to indulge in them. What Eric was asking about was partnership, practical partnership. Two people combining their resources and skills to face a frontier that killed individuals more easily than it killed pairs. He laid out the terms plainly. He had acclaim and farming knowledge. She had engineering sense and toughness. Together they would have a better chance than either of them alone. Also, he pointed out they had not killed each other in 3 months of close quarters. That was more than most married couples could claim. Clara almost laughed. She thought about Robert, her first husband. She had loved Robert in the way young women loved young men, with passion and hope and willful blindness to his many faults. Robert had been charming and handsome, and absolutely useless with his hands. She had built their cabin while he talked about trapping fortunes. She had kept them alive while he dreamed. Robert had died chasing those dreams frozen against a cottonwood trunk because he had trusted his own judgment more than the weather. Eric was nothing like Robert. Eric was practical. Eric worked hard. Eric learned from his mistakes instead of repeating them. Eric was also, she realized, something she had not expected to find again at her age. A friend. She said yes. Not with passion, not with the breathless excitement of young love, but with something more durable, with the calm certainty of a woman who had calculated the odds and found them favorable. They would marry in spring. They would build a new cabin on Eric's claim, incorporating everything Clara had learned about thermal mass and dead air spaces and stone heating. They would keep the cave as backup shelter, as cold storage, as insurance against the winters that always came. And they would face whatever came next, together. The marriage was set for April 3rd, but first they had to survive the rest of winter. And winter, Clara knew from long experience, was never truly finished until the calendar said it was finished. Sometimes not even then. March came in cold but not brutal. The temperatures moderated slightly, dropping into single digits at night instead of the 20 and 30 below of January and February. The sun gained strength, melting the southern faces of snowdrifts during the warmest hours of the afternoon. Clara and Eric began making plans. The new cabin would be built on his claim 4 miles south of the cave. They would use the techniques Clara had developed modified for above-ground construction. Earthen berming against the north wall for wind protection. A stone fire pit system like the one in the cave. Double walls with an air gap for insulation. Eric sketched plans in the dirt floor of the cave, adjusting dimensions, thinking through material requirements. Clara offered suggestions based on her observations of what worked and what did not. It was, she reflected, a good way to build a marriage, starting with practical problems, finding solutions together, learning how the other person thought. The weather held through the first 2 weeks of March, cold but manageable. No major storms, no temperatures that threatened life. Clara began to believe they might make it through to spring without another crisis. She should have known better. The frontier had one more test in mind. April 3rd, 1874. The wedding was held in Utica in a small wooden church that creaked when the wind blew and let cold air through gaps in the floorboards. 47 people attended, which was remarkable for a territory where neighbors lived miles apart and travel was never guaranteed. Clara wore her better dress, the one she had kept folded at the bottom of her flour sack, through all those months in the cave. It was wrinkled and slightly faded, but it was clean, and it was hers. Eric wore a suit borrowed from Samuel Hendricks, too short in the sleeves and too wide in the shoulders, but serviceable. Father Thomas Brennan performed the ceremony. He had come a long way since that December day when he had called Clara's cave shelter desperation. Now he spoke of resilience, of adaptation, of the human spirit's ability to find solutions where others saw only problems. He did not quite apologize for his earlier assessment, but he came close. The vows were simple. The ring was a plain band Eric had purchased in Helena during a supply run. The kiss was brief and slightly awkward, the self-conscious gesture of two people who had become partners before they became spouses. Afterward, there was food. Potatoes and salt pork and dried beef and hardtack softened in gravy. Nothing fancy. Everything precious. Food on the frontier was never taken for granted, especially after the winter they had just survived. Clara looked around at the faces of the people who had come to witness her marriage. Samuel Hendricks, who had warned her about the Peterson family and then sent desperate travelers to her cave when his warning proved unnecessary. The Johnson family, who had moved into their root cellar after seeing her principles in action. The Chens, quiet and reserved but present nonetheless. Old Hans Muller, whose wife had stopped complaining about rheumatism. These people had watched her build something from nothing, had doubted her, then respected her, then learned from her. They were not exactly friends. Friendship was a luxury on the frontier. But they were something close to it. Community. She had not expected to find community here. She had expected to survive alone until spring allowed her to make other arrangements. Instead, she had found this: a husband. A network of people who knew her name. A place in a world that had tried to cast her out. The wedding gift from the community was lumber. Good lumber. Milled boards from the railroad depot donated by William Crane. Enough to build a proper cabin on Eric's claim, with modifications that would make it unlike any other structure in the Judith Basin. Construction began the following week. Eric's claim was 4 miles south of the sandstone formations on a gentle rise that caught morning sun and offered some protection from the worst northern winds. The failed cabin still stood there, its walls stained with water damage, its roof sagging from the weight of snow it had never been designed to bear. They did not try to repair it. They tore it down instead, salvaging what materials they could, and started fresh. The new cabin would be different. Clara had spent the winter observing how heat moved through enclosed spaces, how cold found its way through gaps and cracks, how the constant battle between inside warmth and outside cold could be won or lost based on design choices made before the first board was nailed. The north wall would be bermed with earth, 3 feet of soil piled against the exterior, creating a barrier that one could not penetrate. The technique was ancient, used by every cold climate culture that had ever existed, but somehow forgotten by the settlers who built their thin-walled cabins and wondered why they could not stay warm. The interior would feature double walls with a 6-inch air gap, just like the cave. That dead airspace would trap heat, creating a buffer between the living space and the outside world. The same principle that had kept Clara alive through December and January would keep them comfortable for years to come. The fire pit system would be replicated exactly. A stone-lined depression, a gravity-fed ventilation system, a chimney that drew smoke away from the living space, while allowing heat to radiate from the stones long after the flames died. Eric did the heavy lifting. Clara did the precise work. They argued occasionally about details, compromised more often, and discovered that building a house together was an effective way to learn whether a marriage would last. By June, the cabin was habitable. Not finished, but livable. They moved in on a warm evening when the prairie was green with new growth, and the memory of winter seemed impossibly distant. Clara kept the cave, not as a primary residence, but as something equally important: cold storage, storm shelter, insurance against the winters that would keep coming year after year until the day she died. The cave's constant 45-degree temperature made it perfect for preserving food. Root vegetables that would have rotted in a conventional cellar lasted months longer in that stable environment. Dried meat stayed dry. Stored grain did not mold. Clara made the 3-mile walk to the cave at least once a week, checking her supplies, maintaining the fire pit system, ensuring that the shelter remained ready for whatever might come. She never forgot what the cave had given her. Survival, yes, but more than that. The cave had given her proof that she could build something from nothing. That knowledge and determination could outweigh resources and advantages. That being cast out was not the same as being defeated. The summer of 1874 passed quickly. Clara and Eric worked their claim planting what they could, preparing for the winter that was always coming. The hybrid cabin performed even better than Clara had hoped. Even during the hottest July days, the interior stayed comfortable. The earthen berm absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night, moderating temperatures in both directions. Neighbors noticed. More visitors came to examine the construction. More questions were asked. More principles were copied and adapted to other situations. William Crane, the railroad engineer, documented everything. He sketched the floor plan, noted the dimensions of the air gap, calculated the thermal mass of the stone fire pit. He submitted his findings to the Territorial Engineering Office with a recommendation that similar designs be considered for future construction. The recommendation went nowhere. Governments moved slowly and frontier settlers moved fast. But the documentation existed, and documentation had a way of outlasting the institutions that ignored it. Fall came early that year. By late September, the nights were cold enough to see your breath. By mid-October, the first frost had killed the remaining garden plants. By October 29th, the first snow fell. Clara watched it come down, thick white flakes that accumulated on the ground faster than she had seen in any previous year. Something about this winter was going to be different. She could feel it in her joints, in the way the air smelled, in the particular quality of light that filtered through the clouds. She told Eric they needed to prepare more than usual. He did not argue. He had learned to trust her instincts about weather, about survival, about the thousand small signs that the frontier gave to those who knew how to read them. They spent November stockpiling. Firewood stacked higher than it had ever been stacked. Food supplies laid in quantities that would have seemed excessive in a normal year. The cave restocked with everything they might need if they had to shelter there again. Clara made sure the fire pit stones were in good condition, made sure the tarp barriers were intact, made sure the sleeping platforms were solid and the ventilation gaps were clear. She hoped they would not need any of it. She prepared anyway. The winter of 1874 to 1875 arrived on schedule and then refused to leave. By November 12th, the temperature had dropped below zero. and showed no intention of rising. By December, the pattern was clear. This was not going to be a normal winter. This was going to be the kind of winter that old-timers would talk about for the rest of their lives. Christmas came and went. The temperature stayed below zero. January arrived and the cold only intensified. On January 17, 1875, the thermometer in Utica recorded negative 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Not wind chill, actual air temperature. Clara had never experienced cold like this. No one had. This was cold that defied understanding that existed outside the normal parameters of what winter was supposed to be. The creek froze solid to the bottom. Fish that had survived countless winters died in water that turned to ice around them. Cottonwood trees exploded in the pre-dawn darkness, the sound like rifle shots echoing across the frozen prairie. The ice inside their trunks expanded faster than the wood could accommodate, and the trees simply blew apart. Smoke from chimneys did not rise. Clara noticed this first. She looked out the cabin window and saw smoke falling from her neighbor's chimneys instead of rising. Falling because the smoke was warmer than the ambient air. And warm air rises only when there is colder air above it. In this impossible weather, the air at ground level was so cold that even smoke felt warm by comparison. Physics had stopped working the way it was supposed to. The cabin held. Clara had designed it for exactly this kind of challenge, and it performed as designed. The earthen berm blocked the cold from the north. The double walls trapped heat. The fire pit stones radiated warmth. Interior temperatures stayed around 51 degrees, while the outside world froze solid. Not comfortable, but survivable. They burned firewood constantly, fed the fire pit every 3 hours, dressed in layers even indoors. Got through January 17th, then the 18th, then the 19th. On the 20th, the temperature rose to 35 below zero, which felt tropical by comparison. Clara and Eric allowed themselves to relax slightly. The worst seemed to be over. They were going to make it through. Mistake. On January 22nd, the wind came. Not just wind. A sustained blast from the north that hit 61 miles per hour and held there for 16 hours straight. Wind at that speed did not flow around obstacles. It found every weakness, every gap, every imperfection in construction, and exploited it ruthlessly. It did not care how carefully you had planned or how well you had built. It simply attacked until something gave way. The cabin that had handled static cold could not handle dynamic wind. The double wall system failed first. Wind pressure forced air through gaps that had been invisible under normal conditions. Tiny cracks that had never mattered suddenly became channels funneling cold air into the space between the walls. The dead air buffer that had trapped heat so effectively now became a convection system, actively pulling warmth out of the living space and replacing it with the killing cold from outside. The fire pit kept the temperature from collapsing completely. Clara and Eric fed it constantly, burning through their carefully stockpiled firewood at a rate that would exhaust their supply in a week. But by midnight, the inside temperature had dropped to 38 degrees and was falling 2 degrees every hour. By 2 in the morning, it was 29 degrees inside the cabin. They could see their breath. The water bucket had started to freeze. The fire pit was consuming fuel at an unsustainable rate, and still the temperature kept dropping. Clara made the call. She told Eric they were going to the cave. Now, before they were too cold to move. Eric did not argue. They dressed in every layer they owned, loaded what supplies they could carry in 2 minutes, checked the fire one last time, knowing it would die within an hour of their departure, knowing the cabin would freeze solid behind them. Then they opened the door and stepped into wind that nearly knocked them flat. The cave was 200 yards away. 200 yards. In normal conditions, a walk of perhaps 3 minutes. In this wind, in this cold, with visibility reduced to zero by ground drift, it might as well have been 200 miles. Clara could not see anything. The air was filled with frozen crystals lifted and hurled by wind strong enough to strip flesh from bone. She could feel Eric beside her, his hand gripping hers, but she could not see him. She started walking. She had made this trip 100 times over the past year. She knew it was 240 steps from their cabin door to the cave entrance, knew the exact path, the slight rise halfway through, the way the ground leveled out near the sandstone formations. She counted steps because counting was all she had. Step 10. Step 20. The wind was pushing her sideways, trying to knock her off the path she knew by memory. She corrected, constantly fighting for every step of forward progress. Step 50. Step 70. Her face was already numb, her fingers losing feeling despite the layers of cloth she had wrapped around them. Frostbite would set in within minutes at this temperature. She had to reach the cave before that happened. Step 100. Halfway there if she was still on the right path. She could not tell. The world had become a uniform white, howling chaos with no landmarks, no reference points, nothing except the pressure of Eric's hand and the count inside her head. Step 150. Step 180. The ground was starting to rise slightly, which was good. The sandstone formations were on a slight rise. She was probably still on course. Probably. Step 200. Step 220. She should be there. She should be touching stone. But there was nothing around her except wind and cold, and the horrible possibility that she had veered off course somewhere back around step 100, that she was walking parallel to the formations instead of toward them, that she would die 20 feet from safety because she had miscounted or miscalculated or simply failed. Step 225, step 230. At step 237, she walked into solid stone. The impact hurt. She had been pushing forward so hard, fighting the wind so completely, that when she finally reached the sandstone wall, she simply crashed into it. Her shoulder hit first, sending a jolt of pain down her arm. She had never been so grateful for pain in her life. She ran her hand along the wall, found the cave entrance, pushed aside the tarp barrier, and pulled Eric through behind her. Inside, the temperature was 47 degrees. The wind was gone. The howling was gone. There was only the silence of stone, the quiet darkness of the chamber she had built a year ago, when her sister would not look at her, and her brother-in-law wanted her dead. Clara and Eric stood in that silence for a long moment, breathing hard, shaking from cold and fear, and the adrenaline that had driven them through those 240 steps. Then, despite everything, they started laughing. Not joyful laughter, not even relieved laughter. This was the slightly unhinged sound of people who had just bet their lives on geological stability and won. The sound of survivors who understood how close they had come to dying and could not quite process that understanding in any other way. They were not alone for long. The same storm that drove them from their cabin drove others to the cave. By dawn on January 23rd, 13 people had taken shelter there. The Johnson family arrived around 3 in the morning. Parents and 3 children. The youngest only 4 years old. All of them half frozen. All of them alive. Only because Samuel Hendricks had pointed them toward the sandstone formations when the storm hit. The Chen family came next. 3 people, quiet and efficient, carrying supplies they had grabbed in the moment before abandoning their collapsed cabin. Hans Muller walked in alone, his face covered in ice, his hands so frozen he could barely push the tarp aside. His wife had died 2 weeks earlier from pneumonia, and he had been alone in his cabin when the wind came. Alone, and he admitted later not entirely sure he wanted to survive. But survival instinct was stronger than grief. He had walked to the cave without consciously deciding to his body choosing life, even when his mind was not certain. Patrick O'Reilly, a freight hauler caught between settlements, arrived around 5 in the morning. He had been sheltering in a shallow gully watching his horses freeze to death when he remembered someone mentioning the Mercer Cave. He had walked 3 miles through the storm, navigating by feel and luck and stubborn Irish refusal to die. William Crane showed up last near dawn. His railroad survey camp destroyed by wind that had torn tents from their stakes and scattered equipment across the frozen prairie. He had scientific instruments with him saved, because he could not bear to abandon the tools of his profession, even when his life was at stake. 13 people, 1 cave, 6 days. The storm lasted that long. 6 days of sustained wind of temperatures that never rose above -31 of cold, so extreme that it killed everything it touched. Outside the cave, the world was dying. Cattle froze where they stood, their bodies becoming ice sculptures that would not thaw until April. Horses died in their stables, their owners unable to reach them through the wind. Birds fell from the sky, frozen solid in mid-flight. And people died. The death toll, later calculated across Montana territory, was 214. Entire families froze in their cabins when fuel ran out. Settlers froze trying to reach neighbors just a quarter mile away. Riders froze in their saddles, their horses carrying corpses through the storm, until the horses died too. 214 people who had built their shelters by the book, who had followed the conventions of frontier construction, who had trusted wooden walls and iron stoves to keep them alive. In the cave, no one died. Temperature held steady between 45 and 51 degrees. The fire pit system scaled beautifully burning stones hot once daily and releasing heat gradually for 24 hours. 13 bodies generated enough heat to raise the rear chamber temperature 5 additional degrees. Food was rationed but adequate. Clara had stocked the cave well, and everyone who arrived had brought something. Together they had enough calories to last weeks if necessary. Water came from melted snow brought inside in containers and allowed to warm before drinking. The process was tedious but effective. The biggest problem was boredom. 13 people with nothing to do but wait and tell stories, and discover that survival was mostly tedium punctuated by brief moments of terror. Clara found herself at the center of it all, not because she sought leadership, but because the cave was hers, because she understood its systems, because the others naturally looked to her for guidance on everything from fire pit management to sleeping arrangements. She organized shifts. Whoever was not sleeping would tend the fire monitor the entrance for new arrivals, keep watch for any problems. The children were given tasks appropriate to their ages. Everyone contributed according to their ability. The Johnson children asked Clara to tell them stories. She told them about Scotland, about the Highland caves where her grandmother had taught her the principles that were keeping them alive now, about the ancient people who had understood thermal mass and dead air spaces and gravity-fed ventilation long before anyone gave those concepts names. The children listened with wide eyes, understanding perhaps half of what she said, but finding comfort in the rhythm of her voice. Hans Muller asked her about her first husband. She told him about Robert, about his charm and his uselessness and the way he had died chasing dreams that were never gonna come true. She did not cry. She had used up her tears for Robert long ago. Hans nodded. He understood. He was facing his own version of that loss. The grief that came not just from death, but from the understanding that the person you had lost was flawed, that your love for them had been mixed with frustration and disappointment. They were alike in that way, Clara and Hans. Survivors of imperfect love, trying to figure out what came next. William Crane spent the 6 days documenting everything. He measured temperatures hourly, recorded them in his notebook. He sketched the cave's layout, the fire pit system, the way 13 people had organized themselves into a functional, temporary community. He asked Clara detailed questions about the construction principles she had used, and wrote down her answers with the precision of a scientist recording experimental results. "This is going to be important," he told her on the 4th day. "Not just for survival, for understanding. Someday, someone will look at these notes and understand how this worked." Clara shrugged. She was not thinking about posterity. She was thinking about getting through the next 2 days without anyone dying. On the 6th day, the wind stopped. The silence was almost more shocking than the storm had been. For 6 days, they had lived inside a constant howl, a white noise roar that penetrated even the stone walls of the cave. When it stopped, the quiet felt like a physical presence. Temperature rose to 10 below zero, which felt almost warm by comparison. Clara was the first to push aside the tarp barrier and look outside. The world had been transformed. Snow had drifted into waves 10 feet high in some places. In others, the wind had scoured the ground down to bare, frozen earth. The landscape looked like a frozen ocean, all peaks and troughs and impossible angles. She could not see her cabin from here, could not see anything recognizable at all. The familiar markers of her world had been erased by the storm. One by one, the others emerged from the cave. 13 people blinking in the sudden brightness, looking at a landscape that bore no resemblance to the one they had left 6 days before. The Johnson family had the farthest to travel. Their homestead was 8 miles east, and they would not know until they got there whether it still existed. The father shook Eric's hand, thanked Clara with words that seemed inadequate, and he knew it then, gathered his family, and started walking. The Chens left next, heading south toward their claim. Their cabin had collapsed. They knew that much, but the wreckage might still contain salvageable supplies. Hans Muller did not want to leave. He had nothing to go back to. An empty cabin. A grave he had dug himself 2 weeks before the storm. Memories of a wife who had spent 20 years complaining about his cooking and his snoring and his failure to become rich, and who he missed now with an intensity that surprised him. Clara told him he was welcome to stay as long as he needed. The cave had room. The fire pit had capacity. One more person would not strain their resources. Hans stayed 3 more weeks. Then one morning in late February, he said he was ready to face his empty cabin. He thanked Clara for her hospitality and walked away, his figure growing smaller against the white prairie until it disappeared entirely. Patrick O'Reilly had lost his horses and his cargo, but he still had his life and his reputation. He spread word of the cave to every settlement he visited, every freight office he reported, to every other hauler he encountered on the trails. Within a month, the Mercer Cave was marked on every freighter's map in Montana Territory. A reliable storm shelter, a place where frozen travelers could thaw before making the final push to Fort Benton. A landmark as important as any settlement. The community maintained it. That was the part Clara had not expected. She had built the cave for herself to save her own life. But it had become something larger. A shared resource. A communal shelter that belonged to no one and everyone at the same time. Settlers stockpiled firewood there without being asked. The fire pit was kept in working order by whoever used it last. The sleeping platforms were maintained, the tarps repaired, the ventilation gaps kept clear. An informal accounting was started. Who had used the cave and when, what supplies they had taken, and what they had left behind. The numbers were not precise, but they were kept passed from one traveler to another, maintained by people who understood that shared resources required shared responsibility. Over the next 8 years, an estimated 47 people sheltered in the cave during severe weather. Impossible to know how many of them would have died without it. But the number was not 0. Clara had built something that saved lives, and that something outlasted her direct involvement with it. Spring finally came in 1875. Late and grudging, arriving weeks after the calendar said it should. The ground did not fully thaw until May 8th. But it came, and with it came rebuilding. Clara and Eric's cabin had survived the January blizzard barely. The interior had frozen solid water buckets, becoming blocks of ice. The fire pit stones cracking from the temperature differential. But the structure itself was intact. They moved back in, repaired what needed repairing, and continued with their lives. The marriage that had begun as a practical partnership deepened into something more complicated. Not romance exactly, but affection, trust. The particular kind of love that develops between two people who have faced death together and emerged alive. Clara never had children of her own. She had passed the age where that was likely even before she met Eric. But she helped raise 2 of his brother's children when his brother and sister-in-law died of typhoid in 1879. She taught them the same things her grandmother had taught her. Thermal mass, dead air spaces, the warmth that stone could hold. She never reconciled with Margaret. Her sister wrote once in 1881, a short letter apologetic but not quite apologizing, explaining but not quite excusing. Henry had died 2 years earlier. The land had been sold. Margaret was living in Helena now, in one of those charity houses Clara had refused to enter on that November day when everything changed. Clara read the letter once, then burned it. She did not write back. Some wounds did not heal. Some betrayals could not be forgiven. She had made peace with that long ago, standing in the cave entrance, watching smoke rise from a chimney that used to be hers. The years passed. Eric died in 1891, a stroke that took him quickly, painlessly while he was sleeping. Clara buried him on their claim in a spot where he could see the mountains he had loved. She did not remarry. She did not need to. She had the cave, the cabin, the community she had helped build. She had her memories and her principles and the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had survived everything the frontier could throw at her. In April of 1903, Clara Mercer made her final visit to the cave. She was 71 years old, still strong enough to walk the 3 miles from her cabin, though she had to rest twice along the way. Still clear-minded enough to remember every detail of that first winter 30 years earlier. She brought her grandchildren with her. Well, Eric's brother's grandchildren. But she had raised their parents, and that was close enough. 2 boys, 12 and 14, curious about the old woman's stories, skeptical in the way children always were about tales of hardship they had never experienced. She showed them the cave entrance, unchanged after 3 decades. The fire pit still functional, still used by travelers who needed shelter from storms that came every winter, just as fierce as the one that had nearly killed her. She showed them the sleeping platforms in the rear chamber, rebuilt several times over the years, but still in the same location, still positioned where the warmest air accumulated. She told them about the winter of 1873, when she had arrived here with nothing but a flour sack and the knowledge her grandmother had given her. About the double walls she had built the fire pit system. She had designed the temperature differentials she had maintained while the world outside tried to freeze her to death. She told them about Eric, their great-uncle, unconscious on his horse, frozen nearly solid save by principles she had learned in a different country, a different century. She told them about the blizzard of 1875. The 13 people who had sheltered here for 6 days while 214 others died across Montana territory. The boys listened, their skepticism fading as the reality of the cave settled around them. This was not a story. This was a place. They could touch the stones their great-grandmother had placed here. They could feel the temperature difference between the entrance and the rear chamber. They could understand in a way that stories alone could never convey what survival had required in this place and time. The older boy asked if Clara had been scared. She thought about it for a moment. Then she said yes. She had been terrified. Every day for months, she had been terrified that she would make a mistake, that she would miscalculate something, that she would die alone in a hole in the ground, while her sister pretended she had never existed. But terror was not the same as paralysis. Terror could be used. It could sharpen focus, clarify priorities, burn away everything that was not essential. She had been terrified, and she had used that terror to stay alive. The younger boy asked why she had not just gone to town, Helena or Fort Benton, somewhere with buildings and people and help. Clara smiled. She said she had considered it. For about 5 minutes, standing at the edge of the claim that used to be hers, watching smoke rise from the chimney of the home that had thrown her out. But going to town meant depending on others, meant charity and competition, and the constant awareness that your survival rested on someone else's goodwill. The cave had required more work, more risk, more fear. But the cave was hers. She had built it with her own hands, kept it warm. With her own knowledge, survived in it through her own determination. That mattered. The boys were quiet for a while, processing this. They had grown up in a world where survival was largely taken for granted, where buildings were sturdy and food was available and death by freezing was something that happened in stories. They could not fully understand what Clara had faced, but they could respect it, and that was enough. Clara stayed in the cave for an hour that day, sitting on the sleeping platform she had built 3 decades earlier, feeling the stable temperature that had saved her life, listening to the silence that stone provided. Then she walked home. She died 8 months later, in December of 1903. Peacefully in her sleep in the cabin she had designed with Eric all those years ago. The fire pit stones were still warm when they found her in the morning. The cave remained functional into the 1920s. The sandstone formations were eventually incorporated into a state land preserve, protected from development, accessible to anyone who wanted to walk those 3 miles from the old Mercer claim. In 1967, a team of archaeologists from the University of Montana surveyed the site. They found Clara's original fire pit still intact, the stones showing heat marks from decades of burning. They found the remnants of her sleeping platforms rebuilt many times, but still in the same positions she had chosen that first November. They found charcoal deposits that they carbon dated to 1873, confirming what local legend had claimed for nearly a century. There is a historical marker there now, 3 miles west of what used to be the Mercer claim near the sandstone formations that Clara first noticed during a water haul in the spring of 1873. A bronze plaque set in stone explaining in 200 words what Clara proved in a single winter. Survival on the frontier was not about overpowering nature. It was about understanding nature well enough to use its principles. Thermal mass storage worked in Rome and Montana for the same reasons. Skepticism was healthy, but observation was better. Sometimes the best shelter was the one that had already been there for 10 million years, waiting for someone practical enough to recognize it. Modern engineers studying passive solar design and geothermal stability use Clara's cave as a case study. The temperature data collected in the 1960s confirmed what she had known intuitively. Sandstone formations in that region maintained year-round temperatures between 45 and 52 degrees, regardless of surface conditions. Proper ventilation could be achieved through simple gravity-fed systems. Thermal mass would always outperform insulation alone for temperature stability. Her fire pit design appears in survival manuals and off-grid building guides. The principle she demonstrated working with geology instead of against it shows up in modern, sustainable architecture under different terminology, but identical physics. The frontier is gone now. The conditions that made Clara's cave necessary do not exist anymore in Montana. Central heating and insulated construction and emergency services have made survival a less individual proposition than it was in 1873. But the knowledge remains valuable. The willingness to observe what works instead of assuming what should work. The understanding that ancient principles often outperform modern assumptions. The recognition that being cast out is not the same as being defeated. Clara Mercer's story is not about conquering nature. It is about paying attention to what nature was already doing and being smart enough to get out of the way and let it work. Sometimes the best tool is observation. Sometimes the best shelter is the one that requires the least fighting. And sometimes wisdom looks like a Scottish woman standing at a cave entrance in 1873 watching smoke rise from her sister's chimney and deciding that rejection might be the best thing that ever happened to her.